Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here today. This morning in Barcelona, this afternoon in Singapore, in the ICT for Good workshop in Asia. So I guess that you can see my slides, right? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going, as said by Wei Yu, I'm going to present Decidim, Technopolitical Networks for Participatory Democracy. So this is a study that was done while doing my PhD at the Universidad Pompeu Fabra, where I'm working now as adjunct professor, while my main affiliation is I hold up a position in the Wikimedia Foundation. And also this work has been done in collaboration with the project Decidim that I will present from a research perspective and then to a practitioner perspective as well, where I've been serving in areas related to research and data, and currently as a member of the board. So the work I'm presenting, and it was part of my PhD research, is inspired by the notion of the platform society. So we live surrounded by platforms. Like we publish and interact with posts on Facebook. We share messages in platforms like WhatsApp, like TikTok, microposts on Twitter, photos on Instagram, videos on YouTube. So in some way, platforms have become central on the web. In fact, platforms have transformed that original idea of the World Wide Web based on interlinked resources distributed all over the internet by creating these centers of attention, these centers of participation that platforms are playing that role on the current internet. And at the same time, in recent years, we are witnessing the rise in popularity of a specific type of platforms, which are the civic technologies, and that you have been reviewing during this workshop. So these platforms are information and communication technologies that are aimed to scale up citizen participation to promote new forms of democratic governance. For instance, platforms for online petitions, or platforms for citizen debates, citizen assemblies, platforms for participatory budgeting, for open data and accountability. So we are seeing that there is a trend in the use of these platforms for these new forms of governance, of democratic governance. However, as it was explained by Joseph Van Dijk and colleagues in their book, The Platform Society, platforms are not only technological tools that allow people to do things online. The logic and the logistics are more about facilitating. They actually shape the way we live and how society is organized, since a very important part of our lives are currently being mediated by these platforms. How these platforms are defined and the design of the platforms and the affordances of these platforms are shaping somehow part of our current lives. So this was the main these affordances effective might have a social and political consequence. So obviously the approach for doing that was to use computational statistical methods for observational studies with data that was open and without the awareness of participants and without manipulating the environment. So there was a constraint since the experimentation with real participants that are using this platform for co-creating public policies for their living conditions was going to be ethically problematic. So that was the reason of using a non-invasive experimentation. So trying to observe when some interventions were done in those platforms and trying to examine what was the result of those interventions. So for my research, I focused on 3 of them. One was Meneame, which was kind of a Spanish Reddit that became very popular for the 50M movement. Another platform was Decide Madrid, which was the platform launched by the city of Madrid for direct democracy, including participatory budgeting, online petitions and consultations. But the one I'm going to present today is the case of Decidim Barcelona, and I will give some details about this platform afterwards. And in particular, I was interested in a research question around, which was a question from the team of that project, about how to effectively introduce discussions in online petitions. Okay. So this was, as I say, is a question that emerged from the team of Decidim Barcelona, but it was also a question that appeared in the research literature, because previous research in online petition platforms from local institutions were reporting very little success about discussion dynamics. So some studies in the United Kingdom's councils, there was some research proving that most users, they don't visually identify that there was a possibility to discuss those petitions, and there were just a very few comments around them. Also, another study around focus on local platforms for places in Germany, Scotland, and Norway. They also conclude that petition forums were barely used. So there was like a very little use of this possibility, of this feature. Even that it was deployed, there was an interest for at least a possibility to discuss these online petitions as ideas for public policies. Very few citizens were using this possibility. Okay, so the case study that I'm going to present is the city in Barcelona. And I will give more details afterwards, but the city in Barcelona is like the city participatory democracy platform that is able to host multiple processes for state city planning, citizen initiatives, and other forms of democratic governance. At the same time, is the largest free open source software launched by the city of Barcelona, and is an illustrative example of a public infrastructure for the commons for sovereignty using public funding. And as I will also explain in the practitioner part of the talk, the second part, is co-designed by an open and collaborative community, which is also an ecosystem that includes small and medium-sized business organizations, but also citizens, activists, designers, and so on. So in the case of the city of Barcelona, just for give you some examples, these are some data that I think was taken last year. Now it changed because there has been participatory budgeting has increased, but yeah, the platform has like thousands of participants with many different processes running up, with many assemblies, thousands of proposals that have been shared in the platform, with different debates around the city. And the main idea of the city in Barcelona was launched in 2016 for a specific purpose. So in Catalonia, every new local government is aimed to create a municipal action plan, which is the plan that the strategic plan that this new government will have to implement, and is expected to include practices of citizen participation. So the city in Barcelona was originally created to provide support and to make it this to scale up participation through the use of technology. So at that time, there was a process over 3 months in which there were petitions, proposals that were created by the city council, which were the ones from the program of the political party that won the elections. But then over these 3 months, citizens were invited to create new proposals, to discuss existing ones, to support them. And finally, well, these are the numbers. Like also there were offline meetings in which citizens, they were able to discuss the proposals that appear in the platform, also discuss ideas to then share those ideas in the platforms. And in the end, like there were like thousands of citizens of Barcelona engaged in this process, both offline and online. Just to provide you with these numbers. So there was like over 10,000 proposals from either the city council, Ayuntament, some from offline meetings, citas presenciales, some from regular citizens in the platform, and also from organizations with special accounts that related to civic organizations. As we can see, like more than 62% of the proposals were accepted. Most of the ones that belong to the city council that came already from a previous participatory process by that political party have a high rate of acceptances. Also, the ones of online meetings and organizations will help us to imagine that when people were meeting together, either in an organization or in an offline meeting, they have higher chances to be accepted rather than when there were ideas created in an individual manner. And then we were able to examine like how these were implemented in different areas, like in good living, global justice, plural economy, good government of ecological transition. So, well, as I say, this was the idea of creating this process through the use of technology. But at the same time, there was an interest in not only creating a process in which citizens were creating proposals and supporting to be implemented, but also to discuss them. So we collected a data set with over 10,000 petitions and over 18,000 comments between these 3 months, between February and April 2016. The main idea about this discussion of comments, it was like there was like an internal debate within the team of Decidim Barcelona around how to promote deliberative practices of decision making around citizens. So there was an interest to promote this practice of discussion that they were not seen so effective in previous platforms. So there was a review of how these forums for petitions were done. And what we found is like there were 2 different approaches. One of them was to use pros and contras. So users are able to add arguments in favor or against the proposal, and typically like sewing them into columns and being able to vote them and rate them. So that facilitates decision making, since users can see what are the best arguments and counter arguments to that idea. But also some other platforms, they were using like threaded discussions, like the one in Reddit. So being able to create replies to the proposal, replies to the replies, replies to the sub-replies, etc. So creating threads as done in platforms like Reddit to engage users in discussion. So not only to promote these practices of publishing and supporting and creating a market of attention, but also to engage citizens in a citizen debate. So finally, what was implemented in Decidim Barcelona was an hybrid approach between both of them. So conversation threading was approached like a forum style, but also there was for the first level comments, so comments directly in response to the proposal, users were able to say whether it was positive, so it was a supporting argument, it was negative, an opposing argument, or if it was neutral. So this is an example. This was a proposal for creating a local energy company that actually was implemented some years ago. And there was some users creating pro arguments or contra arguments, and then being able to have this discussion within those arguments. So the interesting part from a research perspective is that since we are now having those comments and those comment and thread discussion, then we are able to create threads of discussion and model as a network. In particular, model them as a tree network. So we are able to model the reactions to these petition comments as discussion cascades. Like imagine this is the proposal, so we are able to see all these comments, whether they are positive or negative, and these positive comments and these negative comments, we are able to examine the different kind of cascades of comments, the structure of those cascades, to evaluate deliberative practices within the platform. And for doing that, well, there is like a lot of literature around the structural properties of online discussion threads. If this is a comment and a sub-comments, sub-comments, etc., we can examine the size of the cascade, the width, which is the maximum number of messages at any reply level, or the depth, like how many, what is the maximum depth achieved between the exchange of arguments between users. And also, if the message authorship is known, we can even consider how many users were involved in the discussion. And the reason of using this kind of metrics is that these metrics, in some studies led by colleagues like Sandra Gonzalez Bailón, they saw that these network-based characteristics can help us to capture necessary conditions for deliberation in online discussions. So this is based on an assumption that for deliberation to take place, there are different components. One of them is representation, so being many people involved in the discussion. At the same time, the argumentation, so being like a rich exchange of ideas within the discussion. So if we are thinking about a discussion thread, we can imagine like a thread with high level of width has a lot of representation, while a thread with a lot of depth has a high level of argumentation. So ideally, we want to look for threads that are involving many users with a lot of exchange of ideas. So for capture both width and depth, we can use metrics like the H-index. So the H-index is, if we have this kind of network, like the one that we saw before, we examine for each level, which is the maximum level that has as many comments as the level. So in the first level, in this example, we have 9 comments. In the second level, we have 9 comments as well. In the third level, we have 6 comments, but in the fourth level, we have less than 4 comments. So the H-index of this discussion tree will be 3. So it's a very basic metric that helps us to capture the complexity of the structure of the thread. Okay. So, well, we collected the data set with all the discussion cascade created to all the comments to proposals in Decidim Barcelona during that process. There was some that the original message was positive, or some other was negative, and some other was neutral. And what we observed is like most of them, they were neutral, maybe because they wanted to expose their alignment to the idea, or because they even maybe did not identify that feature. So in the end, only a very small fraction, like the 5% of comments, were negative. Okay, but interestingly, those negative comments, they were the ones that created the larger cascades. So there were very few comments, around 5%, but they were able to create much larger discussions. Okay, so this is in terms of the size of the cascade. But if we examine not only the size, but we compare the size with the width, the depth, and the H-index, what we found is like when a comment did not trigger a discussion cascade, there was a high probability that that comment was either neutral or positive. So there was a comment that was not showing some alignment to the idea, or it was just reinforcing the idea, it was not creating a cascade. But when there was a negative comment, that was creating some discussion and some deliberation practices around decision making. And if we just remove the neutral ones to remove the hypothesis that maybe was not identified by citizens, if we examine the polar discussions, the one originated by positive and negative comments, what we found by doing some evaluation doing some addressing the imbalance between positive and negatives for sure, by doing bootstrapping, what we found certainly is like negative comments, they were more able to create discussion cascade and creating those practices. So this original idea about the cities of the team of the city in Barcelona on how to create a platform that was able to promote those discussions around the petitions, it seemed that this hybrid approach was more effective than the ones in the past that were either just showing conversation threading or just showing positive and negative. So combining both was help us for us to examine this. So the main question was how to effectively introduce discussion in online petition platforms. So what we found is like this deliberative platform design of Barcelona, of the city in Barcelona, allows citizens to discuss neutral and positive and negative comments. So even that very few comments were negative, these were the ones that were very successful in engaging citizens in that discussion. And well, this is consistent with the basic of cognitive dissonance. So if there was someone proposing ideas opposing the main content of the proposal, it was expected that the author was going to reply back to that, and that create different communities to discuss around that. Okay. So, well, the lessons that we learned from this research, this is one example of the research I was doing at the time during my PhD, is like, well, first you need to compare platforms. So in this case, I only use Barcelona, but if someone is interested, we can discuss on how to compare these dynamics over different platforms and even different instances of the same technology, like Decidim in different cities, and being able to compare dynamics. But essentially, the value of building a community that includes developers of these platforms with researchers and activists, and in my case, in the role of a researcher, how to bring those research questions that emerge from the activists, emerge from the developers, and how to use these computational approaches to give in return some results around those questions. And this is the part from from the research and somehow the evaluation of how the relevance of the impact of the design into the dynamics. So even in Barcelona, there was some high level of awareness of the non-neutrality of technology, but this kind of research helped us to also to examine how important is to design technology in a critical manner to being able to understand if these platforms are for political participation, what are the political and social impact or consequences of designing technology in one way or the other. And this is the part of the essence of the platform that I was presented with, is Decidim. That, as I said, well, Decidim is an open source participatory democracy platform for citizens and organizations. So the main idea of this platform, that is the one that is the technology that's being used in Barcelona, is trying to understand, like, if we consider our political life in different axes, like the centralized and decentralized, public and private. We can see in the centralized side, for the public, we have the state, the city councils. For the private, we have these big corporations, but also we are observing now much more decentralized forms, like the sharing economy capitalism in the private side, but also the common solidarity economic cooperatives in the public common side. So ideally, if we as citizens are in the middle, the main purpose of the Decidim is trying to build an infrastructure that allows us to connect citizens with city councils and also these organizations. And as you commented in the beginning, this is a platform that is started in Barcelona, but is now being used in many other cities, like many cities in France, Helsinki, in Italy, in Belgium, but also out of Europe, like New York City, Mexico City, cities in Japan, in Argentina, but also in different regions and regions or even super regions, like the European is the platform that is being used now by the European Union for their participatory processes, but also for civic organizations like Greenpeace or different universities in Europe. So just to explain what are the main principles of this platform, this is the one that I presented in the research part. Like, this is a platform that to provide some understanding, we always present these 3 layers of the projects. So it's a platform to enable democracy in a political level. So the political level, it will be a specific platform for co-decision. In the case of Barcelona, it's Decidim.Barcelona, but this other platform that exists in other cities will be the Decidim platform of Helsinki, or the one of New York, the one of Mexico City. There's the technical layer, which is the technology, which is the factory, is the technological code that provides that infrastructure. And finally, there is the technopolitical layer, which is the community, which is the one that co-design and take decisions around how this platform should be taken, and that incorporates researchers for informed decision making. And this community is called the Decidim community, or the Meta Decidim. So if we focus in as I say, in the political layer, so the political layer, if you go to Decidim.Barcelona, you will find this. You will find the platform, in this case of Barcelona. This is a screenshot I took yesterday. So now they are discussing, this is a specific participatory process to decide some roles in the city. So this is the political side, like how to take political decisions among citizens. And well, at this moment, the one in Barcelona, these are the updated numbers. So it has been run like over 70 participatory process with over 70 councils that are discussing there as well, and different initiatives that are being posed by the citizenry to create new policies. That was the political layer. If we focus on a technical one, the technical one, as I say, is the code. So the code is hosted on GitHub. It's a code that is being developed open source and with a free license. And if you go on GitHub, you can see all the different implementations on Rapid Rails that allow to include features like proposals, like votings, results, accountability, participatory text, newsletters, surveys. So being able to create these different features within the platform, like you are able to create as many spaces as needed or as many processes are needed, and then to populate them with all these existing features, like having a blog or having participatory budgeting or having participatory budgeting and proposals. So being able to create a puzzle of participation, which is the main idea. So trying to consider all the different forms of participation that can occur in this kind of platform, like proposing, meeting, deliberating, deciding, and monitoring also accountability, and being able to deploy in each process or in each assembly all the features that are needed for those processes. And one of them that I mentioned with this meeting is quite relevant because it's one of the main features was deployed, and it's this idea trying to consider that this is like when we're building digital platforms, like the one of the example of the Decidim, are not supposed to create only new forms of governance, but also to reinforce the existing participatory dynamics that exist in our cities, in our regions. So this is one of the first features that was deployed. We was able how to create like a map and a calendar with the meetings in which the existing committees on the cities were able to gather, discuss ideas to be then dumped into the platform, or to discuss at the same time ideas that were already in that platform. So create like an hybrid approach of the offline and online dynamics, and not to replace the dynamics of the city, of the region, of the civic organization with technology. So being able to reinforce the offline and the online settings. As I say, this is the code is open source, and actually it's free. It has a free license, a FERO General Public License 3.0, which is a license that make the code available to anyone, but at the same time, any new development based on the Decidim has to keep this license. So it's a way of making public the code, but at the same time to guarantee that new developments are not going to be privatized. So it's a public common that cannot get privatized, and there is a lot of this is a very strong political statement from the team and from the committee from the early beginning. But something that maybe is not said when we're talking about civic technologies is like when we're using licenses, these kind of licenses are for the code, but we cannot use this kind of license for the practice. So when we are developing this platform and using free license, we cannot guarantee that technology for democracy or for citizen participation can be used for a non-democratic purposes. And actually, citizen participation per se doesn't need to be democratic. Like we can see many kind of political practices that are participatory, based in non-democratic or not fair or not aligned with justice principles. So what we build in the Decidim is something that is called the social contract. So anyone is able to use the code according to the free license, but also there is a social contract that gives some principles, some guarantees around collaboration, transparency, traceability, integrity, privacy and security. So there is the association, the Decidim association that we built to govern the code that promotes the adherence of organizations and citizens to this social contract to follow these principles. And if they are done, if they are fulfilled, those instances of the Decidim will be recognized as following the social contract and the best practice. And finally, the last layer is the technopolitical one. So this relates to what I was presented in the research side. So as I saw the way you design technology, for instance, this very specific example of how you create comments into petitions might trigger some forms, some dynamics or some political practices of the other. So in the end, it's very relevant to consider the design of these platforms. And also, if we are designing technology for citizen participation, it's important to rethink who are designing those technologies. Because in the end, if we are creating artifacts of participation that are not participated, the people who are in the design team or in the core team are going to decide which forms of participation might exist, in which way, and which other forms of participation might not exist. So the idea, the last layer, the technopolitical layer, the meta-deciding community is trying to promote a radical form of democracy. So in the same way that the code allows to do a participatory setting for the political layer, we need to also open participation in the way we design the platform. And for doing so, the meta-Decidim is also an instance. So the committee used their own instance of the Decidim for starting new processes, for new features, for bugs, for supports, also for political discussions around how the code should be used. So this is a screenshot I also took last night, some hours ago, about a new process that started in the platform to redesign the city. So there was like almost now 4 years of the project existing, and there has been identified some needs for improvement. So so there was an interest to create a participatory process for the community to decide how this artifact for political participation should be done. And this is not something that just came from the team, but this is something that appeared in our last meeting. So some weeks ago, we have the Decidim Fest, the annual conference, and part of the discussions we were having during the festival is this needs for improvement around the platform in terms of design. And there was like these discussions that promote us and motivate us to create a new process to rethink the future of the project in terms of design. So it's a way of how to consider like all these different layers and how to think in between research and practitioner around the value of collaboration between researchers, practitioners, activists, designers to create in a democratic way the platforms or that are going to become artifacts for political participation. So, well, with that, I think I give like an overview of the research and the project done around the Decidim in these recent years. And I think it took like half an hour, so I will have some more time for. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you. Right. You give us a talk that perfectly combines the two identities you possess. Right? First part of the talk is very research heavy and has lots of research insights, cutting edge, I would say, data science kind of research seen in the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk really is what I hope to hear from you, how you build Decidim not just as a platform, but also first linked to the political structure over there in the Spanish cities, as well as, building a community, the technopolitical layer of this project or of this practice that really, I think, contributes to the long-lasting effects or influences of this platform. So I really appreciate this very comprehensive talk to show clearly your scholar identity and practitioner identity. So I think we have quite a few questions in the chat. I also saw a hand raised. Am I right? Okay. Anyway, I'll continue just inviting everybody to ask questions. We are such a small group of people. Please feel safe and free to ask any questions. Because Dong Tao's time is really, really late over there. I will invite. Dong Tao is like midnight in California, right? So I will let Dong Tao ask the first question. So then he can probably go rest. All right, please, Dong Tao, what's your question?
Thank you, Wei. That's very nice of you. Thank you, Pablo, for a very informative presentation. I'm very new to this topic, but this is very interesting to me. I have a question. It seems that civic technologists in Europe or in your country have done a lot of good work, fantastic work, very good technology. Do you have any information about how much this civic tech work improved public satisfaction or public approval rate of the government?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question. I don't have the data around public satisfaction. I have some other data that might relate to the impact of those technologies somehow. And that also relates to another question in the chat around successful cases. So in the case of the Decidim in Barcelona, there was the first time that was like a massive amount for this first participatory process, like the PAM 2016-2019, that there were thousands of ideas that then become public interventions, like creating new roles, creating civic centers, or creating new programs and so on. And it was not only the first time that that was done in a massive way, but also the first time that that was monitored. And that was very relevant because it was monitored in real time. So anyone was able to go into the platform and to see like all the public policies or intervention, but public action that has to be run by the council, but not only what were they about, but also to examine what was the source of that public action. So it was able to see what were the proposals that motivate that action, what was the rate of the number of supports, the number of comments by all these proposals, whether they were discussing some meetings, and at the same time, the implementation in real life of these actions. If they were already implemented, they were in their 50%, 60%, or whatever, it was updated regularly. So for me, one of the most relevant things is like the final level of implementation of these public actions was around the I think it was around the 90%. I don't remember the exact number, but usually in Barcelona, like the level of implementation of this public action in the past were always 100%. So for me, that was very relevant because it was the first time that the number was true, that there was like accountability and they was able to examine whether these actions were a motivation by either citizens, the council, organizations, and also what was the level of implementation and be able to evaluate. So in the end, it became like a very helpful tool for the councils, and in this case, Barcelona, to show how their public actions were being implemented and were legitimate by the citizens and other political actors in the city. So I think in that level, it helped. Also, the continuous use of the platforms, because your question was more focused on satisfaction. So this year was launched, well, actually last year, but then it was postponed because of the COVID pandemic. It was launched participatory budgeting for the first time in the city, and the rates of participation suddenly increased. So that helps to also to understand like an important level of satisfaction when there were like processes about the transformation of our city. With Indian is something that we sometimes forgot in the area of civic technology. So there is always an interest in to understand civic technologies from the side of participation, to promote participation. It obviously is interesting, like this is part of the goal of that, to scale up participation. But in the end, those are political artifacts. So our understanding of politics is to transform our society, to transform our realities. So what we were observing is like those processes that were more easily identified to create public policies or to transform our realities, they were showing higher levels of participation. So in the end, that can be also translated into higher levels of engagement and satisfaction among citizens and in Barcelona network over time.
Thanks, Pablo. I hope that answers your question, Dong Tao, right? Initiatives, right, or innovations like Decidim really is not just about promoting participation from citizens. It's also, I agree with Pablo, 100%. It's an innovative form of governance, right? It should also benefit the other side of the game, right? Those who hear from the participants and implement their advisors, right? So this platform needs to be able to help the political institutions to do their job as well, right? Cannot be just a channel to voice opinions or citizens' concerns. It needs to somehow make the governance or incorporation of these voices more efficient. Thank you, Pablo, for that great answer. I think we also have a question from Chen Zhuo, right? I think the question is more or less similar, right, to Dong Tao's question. It also relates to the actual effectiveness, maybe, of deliberation. So Chen Zhuo asked, he would like to know more about the successful cases that turn into real actions. How many of them are from the active deliberations? He is asking this question because he's not sure about to what extent opposing opinions can be coordinated online and become a collective force for change. So they can certainly lead to more active action discussions. So I guess his question is about, just now in your research, you presented how disagreements, right, or negative, so-called negative comments actually contribute to more active discussions. But when we have disagreements, it also means that it's hard to reach consensus and come up with an action plan, right? And turn the action plan into actual policies. So I guess he's asking, how do you see from your experiences, how some of these active and highly so-called debatable discussions and participation on Decidim would really turn into something actionable by maybe the government and the authorities? So what might be some of the examples of this kind of procedure, right?
Okay, well, this is also a great question. And actually, it's very complex to give like a very precise answer. First, because it's about successful cases. So first, we need to think about what is our definition of our approach to success. So that relates somehow with what I said before, like many times we're talking about success in civic technologies or success in participatory dynamics. We're talking about how to measure success in terms of number of actions that were implemented, number of citizens that were involved. And partially, and there was like an excellent work done by a MIT researcher at Hargrave, when he was in MIT doing his PhD, that also inspired me when I was in my PhD, around how CivicTech is inspired by this notion of engagement from Silicon Valley platforms. But this is not only platforms to participate, but platforms to transform. So maybe success is not so much oriented around these typical metrics of engagement, like being addicted to participation, but how these platforms might activate like our level of political efficacy and how we feel that we have transformed society and how they transform ourselves. Okay, so when I think about successful cases, there was a very good example in that first process of the city in Barcelona that was about, there was a discussions about main roads in the city of Barcelona, that they had a lot of traffic and they were asking for some interventions to reduce traffic. And there were like different requests from different neighborhoods. And at some point, committees for different neighborhoods start to discuss between themselves. So there was one committee that was asking for the road to be covered, for having no noise. The others were also asking for another kind of intervention, and they start to discuss because some of them, they were saying like, that road was created because of the Olympic Games in 1992. And that road somehow was like a scar in the neighborhood. While in the other case, that road already exists because it was one of the main roads to enter into the city of Barcelona, and then houses will build around it. So even that it was a similar situation, like there was a historical background that might be more conflicted for the other. So for me, having citizens that they didn't know each other discussing about the legitimacy of their request and to being exposed to different realities, for me, this is a high level of success. So this is part of, and those counter argumentations has a lot of political value, which was part of the inspiration of that. Another example is there was like a very popular proposal that finally was partially implemented around the regulation of the rental market, because as many cities nowadays, like housing is not affordable. And there was one of the first comment was negative, saying like, okay, this is not our problem. If you don't have money to pay a house in this neighborhood, you should move to another neighborhood. And then there were reactions to that comment saying like, okay, I've been living in this neighborhood for over 40 years and I'm not living because I don't have money for living here. It's not a problem of my economical possibilities. It's a problem of speculation. Like I'm being kicked out by some forces. So for me, this also was kind of success, like being exposed to different opinions. It was a very successful political experience. At the same time, I should say that it was the first process. So maybe there might be some bias around civility of comments. So at that time, there were no trolls or there was not hate speech in the platform, and somehow it never reached those levels. So that's the reason why counter-argumentation I consider a success in this case. So if we reach some level of troll or misbehavior, I agree that then those successful cases might be different. And this is also part of the discussions that are being surrounded by the community. Like, we are aware that trolls will arrive eventually, and it will be important to see like how to prevent misbehavior and harassment in those discussion dynamics before they emerge. But for the moment, I think being exposed for different realities, citizen realities, from a political perspective are very successful experiences.
Thanks, Pablo. The answer, I love the answer. For all deliberation, so-called researchers and practitioners, right? We have the same hope, right? It's a long-term project. It's not just about coming up with solutions to certain problems, right? It's also a kind of a civic education, right? To educate citizens the complexity of policy making, right? What you want from the government might be totally not what other people want, right, from the government. Through this kind of direct engagement with each other on the very specific policy issues, right? They can realize there are different realities policy has to address. So when the policy really comes out, right, no matter which version it is, maybe they at least understand the motivations behind that policy making a little better, right? So I really love that that answer. Well, but can I take the advantage of being a moderator to add on one of part of your answers, right? So you said on this Decidim there were not a lot of incivility or trolling or misbehaviors, right? I was just wondering how you managed to do that. In other more popular platforms, social media platforms, right? It's quite common to see trolling, right? If not, hate speech, but trolling is very common. So how did you guys manage to control the incivility seen on your platform? Did you like ban people? Did you kick people out if they misbehave?
Wow, good question. This was not something done intentionally, I should say. So this high level of civility, it just emerged. I think just because it was about city public policy, maybe was not so much of interest for possible trolls, so they were not interpeeled. I should say that also there is a negative interpretation of that around the community and the team. Like, and this is it might sound strange, but having trolls is also an indicator of success. So typically trolls arrive when they feel that they can damage something that is valuable. So at the same time, there is like mixed feelings about that. Like in the case of Barcelona, it was very satisfactory to feel that there was civility. But at the same time, it was about like whether we need to be more impactful, because if trolls haven't arrived, it's because we're not getting the level of impact that we should go for. But obviously, there are pros and cons. But I should say, for another example, in the platform Madrid, in the city Madrid, they had trolls in the first week. So massively, they came and they start to post. It was like some kind like the Spanish 4chan platform that just organized themselves to ask for a citizen initiative to create a statue in the center of Madrid with the logo of that forum. So that was easily moderated by the admins. But the interesting part is like, since these platforms are leaving traces around the people who are participating, not in terms of their personal identities, but in terms of who are they replying to. Then by doing some very basic network analysis, it was very able to see like the people who participated in the action, that was an isolated cluster. So it helped us to understand whether this was like some kind of organic ways of participation, or it was like a trolling Goliardic action. And at the same time, like using technology create those traces, create those data that is very useful then to balance and to identify patterns of misbehavior.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Thanks for sharing some of your colleagues' view that you guys actually want to see those as an indicator of the activeness of participation. I saw two more questions in the chat box. I think both are about your research. Kokia was asking where she can find publications regarding your deliberation cascades study. Right, and Chenjo was asking whether the data you used for that study is open source and accessible to other researchers.
Okay, yeah, well, the papers are in my webpage, elaragon.net, are available. The one specific about cascades in Decidim Barcelona was in the proceedings of SOCIM for 2017, and the papers is available on arXiv and open preprint, and also the dataset is open release I release it on GitHub, so I can. If you go to my GitHub, I think it's called Meta Decidim, and there is this dataset with a JSON structure for doing. And actually, no, because after doing this process, we created a hackathon for trying to foster some data analysis around citizens to examine different patterns. So, and we found some interesting results that we never published, but they were fun for us. That was like to compare the language vocabulary between the proposals of the citizens and the proposals from the city council. So the one about the citizens, they were about real problematics. They were talking about traffic, about noise, about things. So they were like, by doing some very basic natural language processing, it was very able to see like citizens were talking about problematics, real problems, real concerns of citizens, while the ones from the city council were talking like their nouns by doing some post tagging, by extracting like the most relevant tokens in that vocabulary. It was about administrative jargon. So it was like about intervention, bureaucracy and stuff like that. So it was able to see like how different are the languages between citizens and bureaucrats. And that was able to examine just by having this data openly released. So yeah, it's available on my GitHub. Thank
you, Pablo. Kokia already managed to find your paper. Go check out Pablo's website and GitHub site for the data and the paper. Not sure whether Simon intended to ask anything. You turn on your video.
I was going to ask exactly about the data as well. I think that would be quite interesting for us. The data for Barcelona, is it in Spanish or is it in Catalan? Sorry.
Actually, the platform of Decidim is available in different languages, and then every instance they set up the language that they want. The one of Barcelona is in Spanish and Catalan, and comments on that open dataset, some of them are in Catalan, some other are in Spanish. So
okay, I mean, that's going to be an interesting challenge. I guess Catalan is easier for me to read, but Spanish might be easier to automatically translate for us. But okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
All right, thank you guys for all the questions you threw at Pablo. Although I still have a lot more questions what I want to ask, but we have a schedule to follow. Pablo, thank you so much for your keynote speech. We learned so much from your talk and your year-long, many years long exercise and practice. So I hope that we are going to be able to continue working together in the future.